Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Venerable Dr. Anil Sakya, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank CASIAN Kunthapana, Chairman for CASIAN, for inviting me to the inaugural forum 2022. I have the unenviable task of being the last speaker, and you've had brilliant speakers before me. Dr. Mahmood and Dr. Mokhtar already earlier focused on the importance of planetary health, implications of biodiversity, protecting nature, adverse impacts of climate change. And if you look at COVID-19, and if you look at really the implications of COVID-19, if you look at maybe the issue, I mean, one thing that really came out, and if you looked at the World Economic Forum risk report, you saw loss of biodiversity, climate change as some of the biggest risks that we face today. What COVID-19 really showed us was the possibilities. In many places, you had blue sky days, you saw mountains. So there was a possibility that our behavior could bring about real change. The other thing that COVID-19 pandemic showed us was the world could actually stop. You know, you would have places where local value chains, you couldn't travel, you couldn't move. So the risks of climate change was actually taken seriously. So, colleagues, I really want to talk about some of the terms that you've been talking about. So today we know that we need to reduce emissions by 45% from 2010 levels. So if you look at how much greenhouse gases we were emitting in 2010, today we need to bring it down 45% below that. And what we mean when we talk about global net human-caused emissions, we talk about anthropogenic emission of carbon dioxide. So this really means human-induced greenhouse gas emissions. Many of you have heard the term zero net, net zero, zero carbon, carbon neutrality, and today in my talk, Back to Zero, Carbon Society, Main Route to Resilience, let me unpack some of these terms. So net zero really means that greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere balanced by removal over time. So that means cutting greenhouse gases as close to zero, while recognizing that greenhouse gases are absorbed by oceans and forests. And the Paris Agreement in 2015 really came to an understanding that we need to reach net zero in the second half of the century. Carbon neutrality means the amount of carbon dioxide being emitted is equal to the amount of carbon dioxide being removed. And before I move to some of the main initiatives, I also want to unpack the term resilience in terms of climate. So we talk about resilience interconnecting social, economic, ecological systems to cope with a hazardous event, a disturbance, responding and reorganizing in a way that we keep the essential function, the identity and structure. So we look at resilience as a positive attribute, and it's a capacity to adapt, learn, or to transform. So in the Marrakesh Partnership under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, we talked about resilient people, and we looked at people in least developed countries, small island, as being able to prosper and thrive. We looked at resilient businesses and economies, meaning that climate risks were fully understood by businesses, investors, societies, and you manage these risks in energy, transport, industry, agriculture, water. And we looked at resilient environmental systems such as biodiversity and natural ecosystems to ensure that we had nutritious food, clean air, fresh water, fertile soils, pollination services. So climate resilience will involve a whole of society. It cannot just be left to governments, it's communities, businesses, the capacity to adapt climate risks, hazards, shocks, stresses. It means that we have to understand when we talk about a 1.5 degree world, since the 1800s, we're already 1.1 degree higher. So we're talking about staying within a warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade. So we know that, so if we look at a 1.1 degree warmer where we are today, and if we look at some of the projections of greenhouse gases, we're going to go to heating of a 3 degree world. So what does a warming world mean? It means in Asia, we have hotter summers. And again, we're going to need more energy demand together with the population. We're going to see decrease in precipitation. We're going to see desalinization, so we're going to see increased water stress. Rising temperatures will lead to heat waves, droughts. We're going to see weakening of monsoon circulation in South Asia. We're going to see more floods. We're going to see glacial melt. So we're talking about adverse impacts. We're talking about our, some of our populations living in low-lying urban areas. We're going to see significant increase in losses due to flooding. We're going to see millions of people have to migrate because of sea level rise. So the importance of moving to net zero and carbon neutrality is really critical for us. So we're talking about, if we don't do this, we're talking about pushing 100 million people at the risk of extreme poverty by 2030. 2030 is not very far away. It's 8 years. 720 million by 2050. We're seeing reducing agriculture by 30%. People who lack sufficient water to increase to 5 billion. I mean, these are big numbers. Increase of climate-related disasters, many more. So we know that we need to transform, and we know that we can't continue with really the dependence of fossil fuel and the investment in coal. And I just wanted to talk about coal because coal, the use of coal really has become an Asian story. 94% of the global pipeline for coal is 27 countries in our region. Most of the world now is phasing out of coal. So the investment in coal is really our region. But when I talk about, so there have really been two tracks of working on climate change. There's been a convention track that is what countries do, and outside a convention track. So in the convention track, countries are all submitting what you call nationally determined contributions. This is how will they reduce carbon. So we have, we have 33 countries from our region who've announced carbon neutrality targets. India by 2070, China and Indonesia by 2060, Japan and Korea by 2050, Russia by 2060. And a really important statistic for us in the Asia-Pacific region is our 7 G20 countries emit 80% of the regional greenhouse gas emissions. So if we look at big gains, we have to look at the G20 countries in a region. But there has been some positive advancements. India has announced that it will meet 50% of its energy requirements from renewable energy by 2030. And last year in August, they announced the National Hydrogen Mission that could make India a global green hub for hydrogen production. And the India Railways has set a target of net zero carbon emissions by 2030 through 100% electrification of railways. Indonesia has said in their 10-year electricity supply a significant increase in renewable energy capacity. China has committed to peaking carbon dioxide emissions by 2030 and to include a share of non-fossil fuel resources by 25%. And China has said they will no longer invest in coal-fired power plants abroad. Japan has also announced they will slowly phase out investing in coal-fired power plants abroad. And they've also looked at a basic energy plan where they've looked at a mix of target of 36 to 38% renewable electricity. Similarly, Korea has also entailed a complete phase out of coal-fired power generation by 2050. So there have been some really positive developments. If I move really quickly to the ASEAN and we look at some of the nationally determined contributions and what countries in ASEAN have said. Brunei have said they'd reduce emissions by 20%, Cambodia by 41%, Laos by 60%, Malaysia 45%, Myanmar 50%, Philippines 75%, Thailand 25%. But again, they've made these reductions conditional and unconditional. Unconditional mean that it would happen, conditional being certain measures, financing, technology transfer, investments, whereas Thailand's gap between conditional and unconditional targets is the lowest, is 5%. Countries in ASEAN have also said they're going to work on carbon pricing as a key instrument. Brunei, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, the Philippines, and Vietnam. Singapore's already implemented a carbon price, and Vietnam a law to develop national carbon markets. So there's also been the outside track, that is the businesses. 1,200 businesses have started to put science-based targets in line with net zero, and we've had more than 1,000 cities, over 1,000 educational institutions, 400 financial institutions, all pledging to join the race to zero, pledging to take rigorous, immediate action to halve global emissions. So a few key initiatives that were launched. Global Methane Pledge to reduce global methane emissions. This was in Glasgow at the 26th Conference of Parties, and end deforestation by 2030, a coal transition phase out, and the race to zero. I really urge businesses to join the work, and I heard earlier references to how businesses within ASEAN can join the race to zero, to end deforestation, and also the Global Methane Pledge. I want to thank you again for inviting me, and thank you very much. And it was an honor to join a very eminent group of speakers. Thank you.